Well, good morning, everyone. Like Emily mentioned this morning, we are actually taking a break from the book of Daniel. So, a little bit of context 24 hours ago, I was actually not planning on preaching this morning, but I heard from Pastor Aaron that he was feeling sick. He's got a cold, running a pretty bad fever. And so we talked about it, offered to fill in for him. And so if you think about it, definitely pray for Pastor Aaron for quick recovery and healing. But this morning we're actually gonna look at Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. So this is actually a passage that we all studied together a little bit over a year ago for a few weeks. So we'll look at it again, and we'll look at some similar content that we looked at a year ago, but I promise it won't be completely the same. So got a little bit of new content for you as well. But as we're looking at Isaiah chapter 9, I want to specifically focus on one of these titles that is given to Jesus by Isaiah. And specifically, it's the title of Wonderful Counselor. In the Hebrew, it's Pele Yoetz. It's literally Miracle Counselor. It's this idea that Jesus is the one who supernaturally speaks into every desire, every pain, every area of our hearts. And I think there's something about this idea of Jesus as our wonderful counselor that really does speak to us as modern people. Philip Rieff, the sociologist, he talks about kind of one of the defining aspects of the modern West is the triumph of the therapeutic. It's this idea that in modern society, we've had this inward shift where we've turned inward in a unique way. We kind of had this fascination with the deepest recesses of the self. It's kind of our inner psyche, our psychology that we're just fascinated by. And there's both, there's pros and cons to this shift in modern society. But I think one of the things we see that Isaiah points out to us here is that as much as we care about our inner depths, Jesus actually cares far more about the deepest parts of who we are. He really is our wonderful counselor, the one who's able to speak into the recesses of our hearts. He's the one who's present with us and knows our deepest emotions, who actually gives us joy in any of the pain that we face. He's the one who protects us from danger, who resolves the conflicts in our lives. I think there's something in all of our hearts that's just longing for that. Someone who just really gets you. Someone who knows you completely and yet loves you fully. That's what I want to get at this morning, is that Jesus, he really is that kind of counselor. I think Isaiah, he shows this to us in at least three ways in Isaiah chapter 9. He shows that Jesus is our wonderful counselor. He brings us joy in anguish. He brings liberation from oppression. And he brings reconciliation for conflict. So look at all three. First, joy in anguish. Isaiah shows us that Jesus, he really is the one who meets us in our deepest pain to actually give us joy. If you look at verse 1 of Isaiah chapter 9, it says, "But there will be no gloom for her who is in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations." So some context here. During the lifetime of Isaiah, the prophet who's speaking here, the nation of Israel had actually been invaded by the nation of Assyria. And so two tribes of Israel were attacked first, Zebulun and Naphtali. And so because of this invasion, this passage says that the Israelites, they're actually in anguish and gloom. They were facing warfare, division, pain, suffering. And I think in a much different way, but still very much a type of suffering. I think as modern people, we really do face an anguish in modern society. While we're not facing an enemy military force necessarily right now, there's still ways in which we suffer deeply in modern society. One journalist, Derek Thompson, he has this Atlantic article that's going to be fully published in February. And he calls the last 100 years in Western society the antisocial century. Kind of his argument of his research is that there's never been a time in the last 100 years that we've been more lonely, more fractured, and more separated from one another. This is a quote from his article. He says, "Americans are spending less time with other people than at any other period for which we have trustworthy data going back to 1965. On top of that, We are one of the most anxious societies in modern times, especially the social psychologist at NYU, Jonathan Haidt. He has really put his finger on this in his book, The Anxious Generation. He just goes through this significant shift that I think we've all experienced, that especially 2010. Something just shifted in our society. The introduction of smartphones and social media that we just have watched as anxiety and depression has just spiked at an incredibly fast rate. Jonathan Haidt, he goes through some of the effects that we've seen from this modern shift. He lists out dread, increase in dread, worry, exhaustion, sleep deprivation, social deprivation, attention fragmentation, addiction. I mean, I think it's fair to say that as modern people, we really do face anguish, despair, suffering. I think, like God's people in ancient times, there's a way in which we face a darkness and can often feel hopeless, suffering, we feel in pain. And God meets us there with this promise in verse 2. Here's what he says. He says, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil." It's this really interesting prophecy that Isaiah gives us of light breaking into darkness. I think part of what's fascinating about this is that the Gospel of Matthew actually takes this and shows that it points directly to Jesus. Matthew chapter 4 talks about how Jesus, for a time, lived in Zebulun and Naphtali. And Matthew, he points out that Jesus, he is the one who is light breaking into our darkness. He's the one actually bringing joy into anguish. I love how the medieval writer Julian of Norwich, fascinating person, by the way, the first female author we have in English. She says this. She says, "God wants us to know that he keeps us equally safe in joy and in sorrow, and loves us as much in sorrow as in joy." It's this beautiful idea that even while we face darkness, when our hearts feel overwhelmed, when we're suffering, that right there along with that sorrow, that God meets us with his joy, and we're able to, he's able to bring light into every corner of our hearts. Part of what has fascinated me about this passage in Isaiah 9 is that it doesn't just say that God brings light into our lives, although he does do that. But the idea is there's this biblical theme that like God doesn't just bring light, but he is the light. He actually is the cure, the antidote, the solution to what we're facing. Boethius, another medieval thinker, he says this really well. He says that God is happiness itself. It's this idea that God, he doesn't just bring joy into your life. God actually is joy. It's this fascinating idea that for us as Christians, if we actually want more joy, more happiness in our lives, what the Bible actually calls us to is more of God. It says that God himself, he is joy. He is happiness. And so when we share in God, when we participate in him, we're able to actually experience a profound joy at the core of who we are. It's fascinating to me that for Boethius, this was not just some abstract philosophical idea. He was a Roman senator who he was betrayed by the Roman government, and he was thrown into prison, actually. He was betrayed by some of his closest colleagues. And while he was in prison, he was actually awaiting his execution. His death was right around the corner when he penned these words. Like for him, it was a very real, when he says that God is happiness itself, this was a tangible hope that he was holding on to at the core of who he is. The idea is that Jesus is the one, he breaks into our darkness with his light. He's the one that can actually give us joy in our anguish. I think so many of us today, we feel a deep sadness. We feel sometimes a profound sorrow at the core of who we are. Maybe for you, in this season of life, you're reminded of brokenness in your family or close friends or family members that you just feel distant from and you just miss them. Maybe for you, it's a chronic illness or medical diagnosis that you've been facing, and it's just the continual pain day after day that you've been facing. Maybe for you, it's a struggle with seasonal depression or just a general hopelessness. Maybe the season of your life is just so turbulent filled with transition after transition. And what I want you to hear this morning is that Jesus wants to meet you in that place as your wonderful counselor. He wants to meet you with his joy and his comfort and his love. This passage, it promises us that Jesus, he knows what you're feeling. He can relate to you. He weeps with you in your suffering. He's constantly at work to bring you healing in your life. I love seeing in the Bible how Jesus does this practically in our lives. One of the most beautiful themes to me of the Gospels is how we see over and over again that Jesus, he's asking questions. We even see this throughout the whole Bible. Just this is kind of what God does. He meets his people in their pain, and he always meets them, or oftentimes he meets them with a question. I think part of what's so interesting about that to me is that God, he already knows everything. When God asks a question in the Bible, it's not because he's like, hey guys, I kind of forgot, could you fill me in? What exactly was going on here? He already knows, he's aware, so why does he ask? Why is he so often coming with a question? And it's because he is our counselor. He meets people in their pain. He asks a question, not to learn himself, but actually to help your heart, to speak into it, to use questions to draw out your deepest feelings and pain and emotions. I love there's hundreds of questions that God asks in the Bible. I just want to look at 4 of them. 4 questions that Jesus asked. First question, he asks, why are you afraid? Maybe you hear him asking that question to your heart right now. He asks, why are you afraid? What do you fear? That fear that you feel at the core of who you are, what's underneath it? What is it that's so big in your life right now that it leaves you terrified? And he promises to meet you in that fear with his love and his comfort. The second question, what are you seeking? He asks, what are the deepest longings of your heart? What are the things you feel drawn by? What are the places you see beauty that your heart just leans into? What is it that you're seeking? And he calls you in to say, I am the one who satisfies. I'm the one who can satisfy every longing that you have. His third question, why do you question these things in your heart? He asks, where are you doubting? Where are the things that the teachings in the Bible that you look at and you just struggle with? He wants to meet you in that place and invite your questions, to welcome you in. And he wants you to see that he is the truth, the way, and the life. He wants you to be able to rely on him. Final question. He asks, do you believe that I am able to do this? He says, do you really believe that I am the miracle counselor? There is nothing for Jesus that's hard or burdensome. He says, do you believe that I am God over everything, able to accomplish anything in your life? Do you believe I'm able to do this, to work this out in your life? Maybe you're here this morning and it just feels next to impossible for you to trust Jesus as a counselor in your life. I just want to encourage you. Part of my own personal journey with God has been just seeing the deep benefit of being able to go to a counselor and or a therapist. I think just in my own journey, I think for us as Christians, if we really do believe what Isaiah 9 says, that Jesus, he is our wonderful counselor, I think we have every reason to say that we should lean into good counseling. That's something that we should benefit deeply from. I know it's been a massive benefit to me. I would just encourage you, if you're walking through a season of life, of deep anguish and pain and suffering, I would just want to encourage you so strongly, would you consider going to therapy or counseling? I mean, it just helps so much to sit down with someone who's going to help point you to Jesus, someone who's going to draw out the deepest pain and sorrows of your heart, to ask good questions with you, and to just help point you to healing and to hope. I want to be very nuanced in the way I say this. I want to give a few practical guidelines. I would encourage you to consider, if you are looking for a counselor or therapist, to just consider seeing someone who is a Christian for your counseling or therapy. I want to be very clear in the way I say this. I think by God's common grace, the grace he gives to anyone, Christian or non-Christian, there are beautiful, incredible things that any therapist or counselor can do, regardless of whether they're a Christian. By God's common grace, there are things that just are true. There are clinical practices. They're incredibly beneficial. I hope you don't feel for me. I know many in our congregation see a therapist or counselor who's not a Christian. Please don't feel condemnation from me there. I just want to encourage you to consider the benefits of seeing a Christian. I just think there's, when it really comes down to a lot of worldview issues, I think you'll find in counseling or therapy that there just are conflicts between the Christian worldview and a secular one. How you approach relational conflict, divorce, parenting, marriage, how you think about friendship, how you think about forgiveness, how you think about sexuality, gender. I mean, the list could just go on. I just think there's a lot of benefits if you're able to find a counselor or therapist who's a Christian, for them to kind of take their Christian worldview and to help speak gospel truths into your heart. So a few more practical things here. I would love if maybe you're in a place where counseling or therapy is something that you would consider, just to give you a few practical resources that you could reach out to. Maybe you're looking for someone who's a biblical counselor. Boston Center for Biblical Counseling has a lot of great counselors that you can reach out to. You also have a psychiatrist on staff. Another resource, Harbor Counseling. They have a mix of both counselors and therapists, and so kind of a good mix there. And also, I mean, one great resource that I've used, Psychology Today. You can just go on their website. They have this long, you can put in all your requirements of your insurance and your preferences, all that stuff. And I would just encourage you, wherever you're at, maybe you're in a season of suffering or anguish, guys, I would just love for you to get proactive care in your hurt, in your pain, to reach out to a counselor or therapist, and to start the process of healing. So this passage, it shows us that Jesus, he's the one who brings us joy in our anguish, who meets us in our pain. But there's a second aspect of Jesus' counseling that Isaiah wants us to see, and it's liberation from oppression. That Jesus actually, he intervenes in our suffering to bring us freedom and justice. To show this to you in the passage, or well, before we do that, I think it's really, really interesting that one of the, we have a lot of these common kind of popular metaphors that we use for Jesus. He's a servant, a king, a shepherd, all good metaphors. But I think one of the ones that we often forget that the Bible uses just as often is this metaphor of Jesus as a conquering warrior, one who's come in to liberate his people from oppression and pain and suffering. Just to show this to you in the passage, Isaiah 9, verse 4, it says, speaking of Jesus, for the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulders, the rod of his oppressor you've broken as on the day of Midian. It's this idea that Jesus, he's the one who breaks the yoke of injustice and the rod of oppression. I mean, just think about how powerful this would have been in its original context for God's people. So they had been invaded by multiple nations at this point, including the nation of Assyria. They had suffered a civil war between Israel and Judah. I mean, they were just torn apart by warfare and suffering. And then Isaiah promises that there is a Savior coming who will bring freedom and justice and will put an end to oppression. Verse 5 says this in such a profound way. It says that every boot used by warriors and every piece of clothing worn by soldiers will be burned as fuel for fires because they won't need them anymore. He says that's how good the liberation that Jesus brings is. It says that when Jesus comes, he will put an end to warfare and establish his peace. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian during the rise of Hitler's regime, he says this, he kind of captures this vision well. He says, we are not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. That is exactly what Isaiah is promising that Jesus does. That he is the conquering warrior who comes not only to heal our wounds, but also to tear down the systems of oppression. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, it kind of goes into this in greater depth. It says about Jesus, he shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. What Isaiah is promising is that when Jesus returns, that he's saying that warfare, Jesus will put an end to it in such a profound way that the tools, like the swords and weapons that they were using for their warfare, will actually be turned into tools for farming. It's this beautiful metaphor of peace and joy, that there's going to be perfect peace established through the reign of Jesus. I am firmly convinced that in our modern society, that Christianity really does offer the best option for pursuing justice and righteousness in our society, which just to be nuanced here, that is not to say, it is true that Christians have often failed to live up to the biblical vision of justice. You don't have to look too far back into history to see the many ways in which Christians have failed. And yet, at the same time, I think the teaching of Jesus and the teaching of Scripture as a whole about justice is so powerful. And it's given modern society its understanding of justice. I think it's really helpful to contrast the Christian teaching with an atheistic framework. Yuval Noah Harari, he's one of the kind of leading atheist thinkers today. And this is his perspective on justice. He says, there are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, and no justice outside the common imagination of human beings. What he's saying is that in an atheistic framework, justice is something purely subjective. It's something that's part of your imagination. It's not something that actually exists outside of you. And then Christianity, it offers something far different. It says that God himself, he is the definition of what is good and right and just. Justice is something objective, something outside of us. On top of that, the Bible teaches that we are made in the image of God, meaning that we have inherent human rights, we have dignity. And to add to that, I think the Christian story, it gives us the resources we need to become people of justice. Kind of the gospel story shows us how to be people of both justice and mercy. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then Jesus promises that one day he will return to put an end to all injustice and evil forever. I think that's a beautiful vision of justice and righteousness for us as modern people. I think we really long for that. We long for a time when cruelty and oppression and suffering will be put to an end. I think one of the saddest parts of my job, which is still incredibly valuable, but just talking with those in our congregation who have faced terrible injustices, who have suffered in horrible ways. Maybe for you, you've faced abandonment, abuse, neglect. Maybe there was a family member or a mentor who was supposed to protect you, and they did the exact opposite. Maybe there was a leader in your life who used their power for harm and not for good. Maybe for you, you have faced just this terrible atrocity of physical or sexual abuse. If that's you, I want you to hear just from the core of my heart that our church wants to walk alongside you. I can't claim that we have every answer, but we want you to know you are deeply loved and cared for, and you are worth defending. I want you to know that we want to walk through that whole process of healing with you, to be a support network around you, to help provide resources and care and love. And even more than that, I want your heart to be able to rest in Jesus, knowing that he did face terrible injustice. He faced abuse. He is genuinely able to sympathize at the core of who he is with the most profound suffering and pain. We'll come back to that in a moment. And Jesus, he even promises that he will put an end to every injustice, to every form of oppression that we face. This passage promises that he will break the rod of the oppressor, the tool, the instrument used for abuse, he will break in half. He will put an end to it. He will end all cruelty, establish his perfect peace forever, once and for all. Listen, if you're here and you're suffering, if you've walked through abuse or neglect, I would love for our church to be able to walk alongside you. I would love for us to be able to support you. Maybe it's something that you've never shared with anyone. I would love for you to be able to open up to someone in your community group or to someone on staff, and for us to just be able to walk this journey of healing with you. And I would love for your heart to just be able to rest in this beautiful picture of the heart of Jesus from Matthew 11. I love how Jesus, he promises that his heart is gentle and lowly. His burden is light. He welcomes us in. I love this vision of life with Jesus. It's a vision of rest and joy and peace. He promises that with him we can find rest for our souls. He is gentle and kind, and he can establish peace at the core of who we are. I would love for your heart to just be able to rest in him, to feel his care for you as your wonderful counselor. This passage promises Jesus, he brings us joy in our anguish. He brings us liberation from our oppression. And then there's a third aspect of this work of Jesus that Isaiah shows us. It's reconciliation for conflict. This passage promises that Jesus, he actually brings reconciliation and forgiveness into our conflict and division. If you look at Isaiah chapter 9, verse 7, it says, "Of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." What Isaiah is saying is that the kingdom of Jesus will increase more and more to be established over the whole world. It's this vision of increasing peace and righteousness. It's a kingdom that spreads without imperialism, without war, but one that spreads through love and justice. It's a kingdom where forgiveness and peace is at the very core of the way that we live. I think it's interesting to contrast this with kind of our modern setting and what we see around us. I think it's fair to say that we all feel kind of a division in our culture today. There's rising conflict and loneliness, separation from family, rising divorce rates, fractured community relationships. And I think we could kind of trace a lot of the sources of how that's happened. I think just one aspect of the multifaceted story is what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls, he calls this modern age that we're living in the age of authenticity. What he's kind of saying is in modern times, we have this narrative that just we're supposed to always be true to ourselves. He defines it like this. He says that each one of us has his or her own way of realizing our humanity, set against surrendering to conformity with a model imposed on us from outside by society or the previous generation or religious or political authority. I mean, we oftentimes live by this modern mantra of just you do you. And there's some good, beautiful biblical aspects to authenticity, and yet it can often kind of be, it can fracture our closest relationships. To kind of say this another way, in a less philosophical way, is I think the movie Wicked actually does a great job. Oh yeah, I saw your heads perk up at that one. The movie Wicked, I think, does a great job summarizing this. Who's seen Wicked in the room? Oh, I know more of you guys have seen it. Yeah. So I think Wicked, it really captures this idea of the age of authenticity. Fascinating movie. And kind of the whole narrative, it's similar to a lot of our modern stories, that Elphaba, throughout her journey, she learns to kind of cast off the constraints that are oppressive, that society has placed on her. Any constraints placed on her by her family, her peers, her school, she learns to cast them all off. Even kind of the crescendo of the whole movie, Defying Gravity. Just to read a couple of the lyrics, Elphaba, what she says is, "I am through accepting limits, because someone says they're so, and if I'm flying so low, at least I'm flying free." That song will be stuck in your head for the rest of today. You're welcome. But I think that really does capture it, doesn't it? This expressive individualism. I will cast off all constraints that society places on me. I will set myself free. I am done accepting any limits put on me from outside. I will be on my own, but at least I'll be free from all the other constraints. I think it's fair to say that while that's come with some good aspects, it's been corrosive to many of our closest relationships, with our family, our friends, our communities, our institutions. I mean, I think the effect on our relationships has just been devastating. Our relationships are fractured. We're facing conflict. I think just to speak for myself, it often feels incredibly hard to pursue forgiveness and reconciliation. Maybe you relate. It's easy to just dwell in anger or frustration at something that someone's done. Forgiveness feels incredibly challenging. Maybe you can relate to kind of the conversations that we play over and over again in our minds of something someone said to us or something we want to say to someone. I think what the biblical vision of community and reconciliation, I think, offers a far better alternative. Kind of the teaching of the Bible is that our truest self, the truest version of you, it's not necessarily the one that's free from all the shackles that society has placed on you, but it's actually the self that Jesus gives to you. It's the new self. It's actually living out our new identity that God has given us as sons or daughters, a new identity defined by righteousness and peace and joy and forgiveness. The Bible says that if you're a Christian, it says that is who you truly are. That all the other things, it's actually us living out our false self. What Isaiah promises is that when Jesus, as he's establishing his kingdom, it's actually one marked by forgiveness and reconciliation and peace. I think as we're walking through all these promises of how Jesus intervenes as our wonderful counselor, we have to ask, how exactly does Jesus accomplish this? How exactly did he bring joy into our anguish? Kind of at the core, what did he do to actually liberate us from any oppression that we're facing? How can he actually transform our hearts so they can become hearts of forgiveness and peace and reconciliation? And I think as we continue through the book of Isaiah, Isaiah gives us this incredible answer to those questions. If we fast forward to Isaiah 53, he gives us more details about this prophesied one who's coming. First, he shows how Jesus, how he brings joy into our anguish. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 4 says this about Jesus, that surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. What Isaiah is saying is that Jesus is the one who on the cross, he took our burdens and our anguish onto himself. He actually took it and suffered for it. Isaiah actually calls Jesus the man of sorrows. He's this figure of suffering and pain, him taking that as our substitute in our place. And so what Isaiah is promising is that Jesus, he took that on the cross to give us this joy. Another aspect of this chapter, it shows how Jesus, how he brought reconciliation into our conflict. Verse 5, it says that he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we're healed. What Isaiah is saying is that Jesus, he was actually crushed so that you could be made whole. He suffered so that you could be healed. I think the only way that you can truly have peace, most of all with God, is through Jesus. It's through Jesus taking the violence and suffering of the cross in your place, him dying for it, him being crucified for it, and taking that for you. That's the only way that you can truly have peace with God and be reconciled with him. It's only through Jesus that you can have forgiveness and reconciliation with God. And the promise of the Bible is that actually, when we're reconciled with God, we enter into this family of God that is marked by forgiveness and reconciliation and peace. Although we often fail in our pursuit of this, I do think the gospel gives us the resources we need to be people of forgiveness and reconciliation. I mean, when your heart is just overwhelmed with the forgiveness that you have from Jesus through the cross, that's going to give you the resources you need so that when you're mistreated, when someone treats you unfairly, when someone lashes out at you, when your heart's able to rest in the forgiveness that you have through Jesus, forgiveness for sin that deserved hell itself, your heart will be able to then naturally extend forgiveness to other people. And guys, I'm not saying this is easy. I think this is one of the most challenging parts of the Christian life, is truly being able to forgive others and pursue reconciliation. But the promise of the gospel is that Jesus, his death on the cross, taking our iniquities and sin, it actually gives us the power we need to be able to pursue forgiveness and reconciliation. The promise of the gospel is that one day, for all Christians, every broken family, every damaged relationship, it will be restored and made new. Every bruise your heart has suffered from conflict, Jesus will bring healing for it. One more aspect of Isaiah 53. It shows how Jesus brings liberation from oppression. Verse 7, it says that Jesus, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. We said earlier that Jesus can relate in oppression and abuse. What this passage says is that Jesus, he did actually suffer oppression in our place. I mean, on the cross, he was beaten. He was stripped naked. He suffered this terrible Roman crucifixion in our place. He knows what it's like to experience abuse and suffering, terrible neglect. And so when we face suffering, if you faced abuse, the promise of the gospel is that Jesus, he can relate. He knows what you faced. He can sympathize with you at the core of who you are. And even more than that, he promises that he suffered. He took your wounds onto himself to bring healing so you could be made whole, so you could have peace at the core of who you are, so you could get free from suffering and sin and oppression. Because of Jesus, every wound will be healed. We can start the healing journey now, and he promises that one day in heaven, the healing journey will be complete. When we're free from all suffering and sin, and God wipes our very tears away in heaven forever. Because of Jesus, every wound will be healed. We'll have perfect peace forever. I want us as a congregation to just be marked by this peace of God. In a society known for anxiety and loneliness, I want us to be this countercultural community of peace and joy and contentment at the core of who we are. I love the way that St. Augustine, I love how he says this in his Confessions. He describes his first encounter with the peace of God. And I think it's one of the most beautiful descriptions of this. He says that when he first encountered God's peace, he describes it like this, speaking to God. He says, "You called, shouted, broke through my deafness. You flared, blazed, banished my blindness. You lavished your fragrance, I gasped, now I pant for you. I tasted you, and I hunger and thirst. You touched me, and I burned for your peace." I want you to have an experience with God like that. To experience his joy and peace at the core of who you are. To just burn for it. To hunger and thirst for the peace of God. I want you to have the light of God just blazing at the core of who you are. It's God's peace that's able to transform us at the very core of who we are. I remember for me, the first time I felt like I really encountered this joy of God. I remember I was a teenager. I was in 6th grade. I was on this trip with my church to Philadelphia. And it was my first time doing something like this, that we were working with a small church plant in Philly. And we just spent this whole week and we were serving the community, meeting some needs of local college students. We were sharing the gospel. And every night we would get together and just spend time just worshiping God and praising him. And I remember, in just a way I'd never experienced before, just feeling the tangible presence of God, just feeling his peace and joy overwhelming me. And I remember deciding in that church basement, I'm like, this is what I want for the rest of my life. Is this kind of joy and peace, this overwhelming sense of the presence of God. Isaiah promises that Jesus, he's our wonderful counselor. He speaks into our pain and our anguish, our oppression, our suffering, and he brings us joy, he brings liberation, and he brings peace, he brings reconciliation. Won't you rest in Jesus as your wonderful counselor? Let us pray. God, I just want to ask that you would help us more and more to rest in your love and your forgiveness and your reconciliation. God, I just want to ask, especially in this moment, for those in our congregation who have faced abuse, neglect, suffering. God, maybe someone here who's facing depression or anguish. God, maybe it's just a season of turbulence and confusion. God, I just want to ask in this moment, would you meet their heart with your peace and your love and your joy? I pray that this week that they would just feel an overwhelming sense of your presence, that they would feel your light blazing within their heart, that they would smell your fragrance, that they would feel your touch, that they would have a sense of your presence and your peace. God, thank you that you are a God who cares deeply about all of our suffering. God, even in all of our questions about why we face suffering or why you might have allowed something to happen, God, I pray that in those moments you would remind us that most of all, you've met us in our suffering by coming to suffer along with us and in our place. You took the cross. You took the wounds and the pain and the agony so we could have healing and peace and joy with you, peace with one another, and a promise of healing and restoration now that will be completed once and for all in heaven. God, would you just help us as a church to live out that vision more and more? It's in your name we pray. Amen.